It began before sunrise. The city of Ouagadougou still slept under a heavy sky when coded messages rippled through the airwaves. At 4:13 a.m., the order was given. ECOWAS had declared war. It was no longer a threat of sanctions or a war of words, but a real assault aimed at the heart of the Sahel Alliance made up of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. In the dim light of the war room, Ibrahim Traoré stood over a map, his face half hidden in shadow. "If they attack one," he said quietly, "they will face us all." His words would soon echo across the desert like thunder. This was not a war for borders. It was a war for ownership, for resources, for identity, for the very soul of Africa. For years, Western capitals had spoken through their regional allies, believing the Sahel would remain divided, dependent, and silent. But now, a line had been crossed. ECOWAS, under pressure from foreign powers, had chosen confrontation. Their official statement demanded a return to civilian governments and threatened military intervention. To the people of the Sahel, it sounded less like diplomacy and more like domination reborn. When the news reached the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, something remarkable happened. People did not run. They gathered. They chanted not for war, but for freedom. The same voices that once spoke in whispers now roared in defiance. Across the markets, schools, and military barracks, the words spread like fire. "We are not afraid." To the rest of the world, these were poor nations. But to their people, this was sacred ground. Traoré knew the cost. Sanctions would come, borders would close, and supplies would vanish. But he also knew that submission was a slower death. "If the price of sovereignty is hunger," he told his ministers, "then we will learn to live with that hunger. At least we will eat with our own hands." By dawn, the battle lines were no longer drawn on maps. They existed in the hearts of millions. A confrontation was coming that would not only test armies, but test the meaning of freedom itself. And somewhere in the quiet of that morning, as the first drone engines rose above the Sahel, the question that lingered in the air was no longer if Africa would fight, but how far it was willing to go to be free. By the second week, the tension in West Africa had hardened into open confrontation. ECOWAS forces began to move. Drones flew low over the Sahel, scanning the endless expanse of sand and scrub. In Abuja, generals announced that the restoration of order had begun. In Ouagadougou, the people called it something else, the return of chains. From the beginning, nothing went as ECOWAS expected. Their planners believed that sanctions, isolation, and a few airstrikes would break the will of the Sahel Alliance. They were wrong. Long before the first missile hit, Ibrahim Traoré, Mali's Assimi Goïta, and Niger's Abdourahmane Tiani had prepared. Supply lines were hidden, communication networks decentralized, and intelligence operations carried out by civilians disguised as traders and drivers. In the Sahel, everyone became part of the defense. When ECOWAS drones struck the outskirts of Fada Ngourma, villagers did not flee. They formed human chains to protect their hospitals and schools. Women carried food to soldiers on motorcycles. Farmers dug trenches with bare hands. The war had stopped being about territory. It had become a moral battlefield. Every strike deepened the unity of the people rather than breaking it. Inside the command bunker in Ouagadougou, Traoré studied the electronic map glowing faintly in the darkness. Red dots marked the ECOWAS units advancing from the east. Between them were hundreds of green signals, small militias, volunteers, and tribal fighters who had pledged loyalty to the alliance. An advisor whispered, "We are outnumbered." Traore did not look up. Numbers do not decide history. Courage does. As ECOWAS pushed forward, their own soldiers began to question the mission. Reports emerged of Nigerian and Ghanaian troops refusing orders. One commander confided to a journalist that they had been told they were fighting dictators, but when they crossed the border, civilians offered them water and bread. "They are not enemies," he said. "They are Africans, like us." On the 12th day, ECOWAS armored convoys approached Kaya. What they met was not a professional army, but thousands of villagers blocking the road. Old men, women, and children stood silently holding hand-painted signs that read, "We will not kneel." The convoy stopped. No one fired. The scene was captured on a phone and broadcast worldwide. For the first time, people saw an African war fought without hatred, a war where faith resisted fire. Meanwhile, in the capitals of Europe, the narrative began to crack. Western analysts, who had once mocked Traoré as a populist soldier, now called him a symbol of resistance. Headlines shifted from "rebels in the Sahel" to "the men who united a continent." In Paris and Brussels, diplomats scrambled to rewrite talking points. The story of intervention was no longer convincing. Too many truths had leaked. In response, new tactics emerged. Disinformation campaigns flooded social media, painting the Sahel Alliance as a Russian puppet. Videos were edited, images reused, and accusations recycled. Yet the more lies were told, the stronger the truth became. Local journalists countered the propaganda with raw footage from the ground. Teachers, traders, and students became reporters. Every phone became a weapon of truth. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed the nation. His voice was calm but firm. "They call us small," he said. "They forget that the pyramids were built from grains of sand. They call us poor, but they forget that the wealth of the world was mined from our soil." His words traveled across Africa like a prayer. The siege had not broken the alliance. It had transformed it. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were no longer three nations defending themselves. They had become one front, one heartbeat. From the highlands of Mopti to the rivers of the Niger Delta, the same message spread, whispered first in fear, then in pride. "If we fall standing." By the 20th day, it was clear that the siege would not end as planned. The bombs had stopped falling, but something far more powerful was rising. Across Africa, people began to see the Sahel not as a battlefield, but as a mirror of their own struggles. And as the dust settled over the desert, a realization dawned on the world. ECOWAS had not surrounded the Sahel. The Sahel had surrounded history itself. The third week of the conflict began with silence, the kind that settles before a storm. ECOWAS forces held their positions, unsure whether to advance or withdraw. Their drones hovered over a land that refused to kneel. The world expected the Sahel Alliance to collapse under pressure, but instead, something unexpected was happening. The siege that was meant to isolate them had unified them. The people had turned their fear into faith. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré met with his two allies, Assimi Goïta of Mali and Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger. Their meeting was simple, no banners or ceremonies, just three men in plain uniforms and a map spread across a wooden table. Traore spoke first. "They believe this war is about power," he said, "but it is about dignity. When we stand together, they cannot divide us." Goita nodded, tracing his finger along the border lines that once separated their nations. "Borders are for those who forgot we were one people," he replied. That day they signed what would later be known as the Declaration of the Sahel Alliance. It was a single page, handwritten and marked with 3 signatures. Its message was clear. An attack on one would be an attack on all. The alliance would share resources, intelligence, and defense. Above all, they would never again allow outsiders to dictate their destiny. While ECOWAS discussed troop movements and sanctions, the Sahel Alliance focused on communication. Local radio stations began broadcasting in 12 native languages, calling on people to stay united and reject fear. The broadcasts spoke of courage and community. They did not call for hate. They called for faith. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the slogan "One Sahel, One Soul" spread faster than any propaganda. Then came the moment that changed everything. On the 20th day, an ECOWAS convoy crossed into western Burkina Faso, expecting resistance. Instead, they were met by villagers standing unarmed along the road. Men, women, and children lined up shoulder to shoulder. One elder stepped forward and said, "You are our brothers. Do not shoot at Africans on orders from those who do not live on this land." The soldiers hesitated. Minutes passed. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons. No shots were fired. The video spread online within hours. The image of Africans refusing to fight each other under foreign pressure became the symbol of the war. In the days that followed, ECOWAS began to fracture from within. Ghanaian parliament members refused to authorize more troops. Nigerian soldiers quietly questioned their commanders. In Senegal, students marched through the streets shouting, "We will not kill our brothers." The tide had turned, not through force, but through conscience. Meanwhile, in the Sahel, life continued with quiet defiance. Farmers returned to their fields. Women cooked for volunteer militias. Schools reopened, even near the front lines. It was as if the people had collectively decided that they would live as free citizens, no matter the cost. In this strange calm, Traore found his strength renewed. He walked among his soldiers without guards, speaking to them not as their president, but as their brother. "This war will not be won with guns," he told them. "It will be won with hearts that refuse to surrender." When news of ECOWAS's internal divisions reached the Alliance command, Traore made a decision. He would not celebrate yet. "Victory," he said, "is not when the enemy retreats, but when they understand why they cannot defeat us." His advisors urged caution, but he only smiled. "The world is beginning to listen," he said softly. In Paris, Brussels, and Washington, analysts watched in disbelief. The operation they had supported to restore order had become a moral disaster. Western newspapers began asking uncomfortable questions. Was ECOWAS fighting for democracy or defending old interests? Leaked reports revealed the truth. Corporations had lobbied for intervention to protect access to gold and uranium. What had begun as a campaign for control was now seen as the last act of a fading empire. By the end of that week, even critics began to admit that something had shifted. The Sahel Alliance had not only survived, but had changed the narrative. They had proven that power did not always flow from wealth or weapons. Sometimes it came from the courage to stand together. In the quiet of his office, Traoré looked out over the city lights of Ouagadougou. He knew the war was far from over, but for the first time, Africa was not waiting to be saved. It was saving itself. 3 weeks into the war, the skies over the Sahel had grown quiet, but beneath that silence, a storm was gathering. ECOWAS troops were exhausted, supplies were thinning, and confusion spread through their ranks. The world still believed the Sahel Alliance would crumble, but instead, something unexpected happened. Ibrahim Traoré prepared a different kind of strike, one that would not target soldiers or tanks, but truth itself. On August 16th, the people of Burkina Faso awoke to an unusual broadcast. The screen flickered to life, showing Traoré seated at a simple wooden desk, wearing a plain khaki shirt. There were no medals, no generals behind him, only a thick folder resting before him. His voice was calm, deliberate, and heavy with purpose. "We have been silent for too long," he began. "While others wrote our history, we were told to be patient, but the time has come to speak." He opened the folder. Page by page, he revealed documents that had been obtained from ECOWAS headquarters and European embassies. They were not propaganda. They were proof. Contracts between Western corporations and certain African leaders, secret discussions about resource concessions, and memos that described intervention as necessary to protect strategic uranium supplies. The truth, long whispered in villages and classrooms, now stood in the open for the world to see. Traoré paused and read one line slowly. "The instability in the Sahel threatens our investment interests." His gaze lifted toward the camera. "They do not speak of our people, our hunger, or our pain. They speak of investments. Tell me, whose democracy is this?" His words cut through the screen like a blade. Across West Africa, millions watched in stunned silence. On social media, the clip spread like wildfire. Hashtags flooded every platform. Hashtag not war. Truth for Africa. Sahel speaks. Within hours, protests erupted in Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal. People took to the streets not to fight, but to question. In Accra, students held signs reading, "No war for uranium." In Lagos, journalists demanded an inquiry into ECOWAS's ties with foreign powers. For the first time, citizens across Africa began to realize that this conflict was not about governance or democracy. It was about control, about keeping the continent chained to the same forces that once colonized it. The international response was immediate. Western media scrambled to downplay the revelations, but the documents had already spread too far. Independent reporters confirmed the authenticity of several files. Photos surfaced showing European cargo planes unloading weapons marked as humanitarian aid. In Brussels, a nervous official told the press, "The Sahel situation is being misrepresented." But few were convinced. The narrative had changed. Inside ECOWAS itself, cracks widened. Some leaders who had supported the intervention began to retreat, fearing backlash from their citizens. In Nigeria, a young general leaked his resignation letter, stating, "I cannot fight a war that serves men in suits thousands of miles away." The letter went viral and became a rallying cry for African unity. Meanwhile, in the Sahel, the revelation transformed the mood from resistance to purpose. People no longer saw themselves as isolated victims. They saw themselves as part of a larger struggle. In village squares, teachers read aloud from Traoré's speech. In marketplaces, traders debated the meaning of independence. Even children began to draw the new flag of the alliance, its colors symbolizing freedom, honor, and unity. For the first time in modern African history, the battlefield had shifted to the moral ground. It was no longer about who could shoot farther or fly higher, but who could tell the truth and stand by it. Western commentators called it the War of Perception. Africans called it something else, the War of Hearts. That night, as the fires of celebration flickered across Ouagadougou, Traoré wrote in his journal, "Empires fall not when their armies are defeated, but when their lies are exposed." He knew that exposing the truth would not end the war, but it had already achieved something far greater. It had awakened the conscience of a continent. From that moment on, the Sahel Alliance was no longer just fighting for its survival. It was fighting for the dignity of Africa itself. What began as a war of weapons had become a war of truth, and in that war, the Sahel Alliance was winning. The revelation of hidden deals had shattered the illusion of legitimacy surrounding ECOWAS's campaign. Across Africa, millions who once watched in silence now stood with the alliance. The battlefield had shifted from the desert to the hearts of the people, and for the first time, Africa was united by outrage and hope. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré understood that moral victories needed to be transformed into tangible change. He gathered his council and announced a new mission, not for conquest, but for creation. "If they use our energy to chain us," he said, "then we will build our own light." Within days, Operation Sunlight was born. Engineers from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began constructing a massive solar grid stretching across the Sahel. The goal was simple: to free Africa from the energy dependence that had been used to control it for decades. At the same time, a new media network emerged from Niamey. It was called Voice of Sahel, run entirely by young journalists. There were no foreign sponsors, no scripted stories. They broadcasted in their own languages, telling stories of mothers protecting villages, of students volunteering at hospitals, of farmers sharing food with soldiers. One presenter said during the first broadcast, "We have heard the world talk about us for too long. Now it is our turn to speak." Those words echoed from Cairo to Cape Town. The effects were immediate. Fear began to fade. A continent that had once waited for permission to dream was now shaping its own future. In the streets of Dakar and Accra, murals of the three Sahel leaders appeared, painted by youth who had never known true independence, but could now imagine it. Across radio stations, a single phrase began to repeat: "Unity is the new revolution." In Europe, panic replaced arrogance. Leaked audio revealed advisors warning, "If the Sahel model succeeds, the rest of Africa will follow." But it was already too late. The idea had taken root. From the ashes of conflict, a new Africa was rising, not through conquest, but through conviction. And as the drums of freedom echoed through the Sahel night, Traoré's words became prophecy. "They can block our borders, but not our belief. They can freeze our banks, but not our will." By the end of the war, the skies above the Sahel glowed not with fire, but with light. The sound of drones had faded, replaced by the rhythm of drums and the voices of people who had refused to kneel. What began as a regional rebellion had become a continental awakening. From the villages of Burkina Faso to the streets of Lagos, a single truth echoed: Africa had changed forever. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, watching the crowd fill the square below. Thousands gathered, waving handmade flags of the Sahel Alliance. There were no soldiers marching, no chants of revenge, only songs of unity and pride. The people no longer spoke of survival. They spoke of renewal. The flags of old empires had long since been lowered. In their place, the banners of freedom fluttered against the dawn. The war had not brought wealth, but it had restored something far more valuable: dignity. Across the continent, nations began to speak with one voice. From Cairo to Cape Town, from Kinshasa to Dakar, Africa was no longer a continent waiting for permission to exist. It was a continent standing on its own. Universities launched courses on sovereignty and ethics. New trade routes formed among African nations. Even in the most remote villages, children learned the meaning of the phrase now etched into every classroom wall: "We build what we believe." The West watched in silence. The reports from Africa no longer spoke of instability or chaos. They spoke of courage, resilience, and rebirth. In Paris, a commentator said quietly, "The age of influence has ended." It was not defeat by force, but by faith. As night fell over Ouagadougou, the city glowed with torchlight. Traoré stood among his people, not above them. He spoke softly, his words carried by the wind. They called us rebels, but we were only men who refused to forget our worth. They said we were poor, but we have found the richest treasure of all: the right to stand tall. Across Africa, church bells and mosque calls blended into one sound, a continent breathing as one. The drums of war had ended. The drums of freedom had begun. And from the heart of the Sahel, a voice rose into the night, steady and unbroken: "Africa is awake, and it will never sleep again."